Welcome to the Juniper Tree After Reading Discussion. This is the first in the series, so I'll tell you a little bit about my interest in fairy tales before we get started. I started reading the stories obviously when I was a little kid, and I read the original Grimm versions too, but it wasn't until I got into college and took a course offered by my honors college called Psychological Interpretation of Fairy Tales, taught by our former university president, that I realized there's a whole academic world devoted to studying fairy tales and folk tales, and that you can analyze them through various lenses. Basically, any lens that you could analyze any literature through: psychological, sociological, feminist, whatever. You can do that with fairy tales. And there are historians who study the origins of tales and trace them back to, the very first story that influenced subsequent versions, and they trace how it changes over time, why it changes over time. There's this whole academic world devoted to fairy tales and folk tales that really fascinated me. And so I started to do my own research and reading whenever I got the chance. And I'm absolutely an autodidact. I don't have a PhD in folklore, so I'm not an expert. But the things that I have learned, I'll discuss here, and the hope is that this will sort of get you to think about fairy tales in a different way than just, no, this is a fun story to tell a kid if you're trying to get them to fall asleep. So, the Juniper Tree. This is one of my favorite stories to read for myself, but also one of my favorites to assign students when I teach a fairy tale unit. And that's because while there are many elements to it that are typical for fairy tales, there are also a few things that make it unique. One of those things is the presence of a male protagonist. And while there are certainly other stories that we're familiar with, like Jack and the Beanstalk, that have a male protagonist, usually when people think of fairy tales, they think of the princess stories that Disney turned into movies. So a male protagonist makes it a little bit different. Another thing that makes it different is the presence of a half-sibling. Now, usually tales are either about an only child, and usually that only child is born after a long struggle with barrenness. Think about Rapunzel or Sleeping Beauty. Or, like Cinderella, who was an only child, step-siblings come into play. Right? The siblings are children that her stepmother had by a previous marriage. But here, the stepmother has a child with the father, producing this half-sibling, Marceline. Or Marjorie, or Marlene. In various versions, she gets a different name, but she is always named, while the son is not, which is really interesting. And there's some things you could do with that. But she's a half-sibling, and the two half-siblings get along. They look out for each other. Marceline asks her mother, doesn't my brother get an apple too? And she, of course, is the one who is responsible for laying his bones under the tree so that he can be resurrected. And the brother, for his part, looks out for her and procures the red shoes for her. So there's this sort of interesting half-sibling dynamic going on in the Juniper Tree that we don't see in a lot of tales. One of the things that really draws readers' attention in this story is the cannibalism. And you might be surprised to find out that cannibalism is not that rare in fairy tales. It does show up quite frequently. It's just that in the Juniper Tree, it's a little bit more pronounced. And the Juniper Tree is one of those rare cases where the cannibalism actually occurs. It's not just the threat of cannibalism. So, for example, we're all probably familiar with Hansel and Gretel. And the cannibalism is not enacted in that one because Hansel and Gretel escape. But we know that the witch's intent is to eat them. Another example of cannibalism is if you're familiar with the original Hans Christian Andersen version of The Little Mermaid. There's blood in the potion that she has to drink to get her legs. So it does show up. But in the juniper tree, it's very pronounced. And one of the things that is particularly disturbing about it is that it is the father unwittingly eating his own son. It's very Shakespearean. Now, the presence of cannibalism and other adult topics that show up in other fairy tales that I'll end up reading at some point, like incest, rape, murder, gruesome acts of violence, the presence of these in these tales is sometimes very surprising to people who are reading the originals for the first time and are used to the bowdlerized versions that Disney puts out. But remember that these stories, for the most part, are coming from oral tradition, and they're centuries old. And their purpose was not necessarily originally for telling children to get them to fall asleep at night. They may have been for telling children to teach them morality, but they also would have been just something that people of all ages shared with one another as a way of addressing sort of a collective consciousness and a society's values, right? Most of these stories are about good triumphing over evil. They are stories where the villain is clearly the villain because they are doing clearly villainous things, and the hero is expected to behave in such a way that they are not tarnished by that. They don't stoop to the villain's level. So keep that in mind. In future readings, you're going to come across some adult material, and that's par for the course when studying original fairy tales and folklore. Another motif that shows up in the juniper tree that's pretty common is the motif of resurrection or death and rebirth. So we have the boy who obviously dies and then is resurrected. This shows up in tales like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, right? And even though Sleeping Beauty's not technically dead, she's basically dead. It's 100 years that she's in a coma. And for Snow White in the original, you can make the argument she is dead. They put her in a coffin, and it's not a kiss that wakes her up. Spoiler alert, but I'll do Snow White some other time. You have this resurrection, and it shouldn't be a surprise to us when we think about the fact that most of these stories that I'm going to be reading are coming from Europe, right? They're coming from Western culture. And you think about how for so long that culture was steeped in Christian tradition. And you have what has now become known in literary circles, a Christ figure. And Christ figures show up all over the place, not just in fairy tales. Even now in, post-Christian Europe, Christ figures show up. Harry Potter, I think, would be the most famous modern example of a Christ figure. So we have, the son who is resurrected, but he goes through a different phase than, Snow White or Sleeping Beauty. He has this interim phase where he's resurrected as a bird first, before he then fully transforms back into a boy. And the way that he is described when he becomes the bird, with the fire imagery, certainly should call to mind the idea of the phoenix in Greek mythology. So you have this interesting mix of Greek mythology and biblical allusion in the reincarnation or resurrection process of the boy. Now, the third common motif that I want to talk about is the presence of the evil stepmother. Now, if you stop someone on the street and you ask them, so what are things that show up in fairy tales all the time? One of the things they'll probably say is an evil stepmother. And I'm not going to talk about that specifically in this video. I'll address it in some future video. But what I do want to talk about is how the stepmother is punished in the juniper tree. She's crushed by a millstone. Now, this is also a biblical allusion. It's an allusion to the verse in Matthew that says that someone who causes children to like fall astray, or someone who harms children, it would be better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck and be dumped in the ocean. So when you think about the evil stepmother in this story, her villainy is almost entirely centered upon causing harm to children. She murders her stepson, but she also traumatizes her own biological daughter. She sets Marshallin up to believe that she's responsible for her brother's death. And this is a child who is probably 4 or 5 years old, right? She's younger than the son. She's not going to school, either because she's too young or because she's a girl. But doing that to a child, and then, of course, causing the cannibalism, the unwitting cannibalism, with Marshallin in the room, right? She says, well, we're just going to make a stew. And Marshallin has to sit there and watch her mother make her brother into a stew, right? So it is incredibly apt that she be killed by a millstone when you think about what that is an allusion to. On that note, there is one more thing about the juniper tree that makes it a little bit more specifically, I guess, biblical in terms of its allusions. In most versions that I've seen, actually probably every version that I've seen except for the one that I read for you, it actually starts a long time ago, as many as 2,000 years ago. And so even in the Grimm's day, if people were thinking, oh, roughly 2,000 years ago, what was going on? Jesus, right? So it almost immediately sets people up to expect that there's going to be a Christ figure. And certainly that this story is going to be about morality. It's going to be about good triumphing over evil and about evil being punished. So those are some things that kind of make the juniper tree interesting to me. And I hope that you enjoyed it. In the future, this is kind of what it's going to be, me discussing tales and some ideas that I have about them and any information that I've maybe gotten from my own research. And I hope that it is for you an opportunity to think about these stories in a little bit different way. And until next time, I wish you a happily ever after.